Hello, Mr. Gauvin and Ms. Steinbach. Today is April 8th, 2020. So I'm obviously not at my home right now. So I just the first room I could get access to, and which nobody had a use for. So I will film myself answering your 4 questions, and if I have enough time, I will answer Eric Limoges' questions. I will start with Marilyn Steinbach's questions. So, the first question is, in your Competency 9 update, you speak of a plethora of resources available for students, but teachers must work with the support staff in order to ensure proper follow-up and cohesion for these measures. So the question is, could you explain what you mean by this statement and reflect on how it is to be done? So of course, what I meant by that is that both students and teachers have access to a lot of options, a lot of measures to help certain students who have learning disabilities or specific problems. So some students have access to tiers-temps. They can have more time for their exams, for their projects, stuff like that. Some have access to electronic dictionaries or computers when they're writing or when they're listening to something. Some have personal meetings scheduled every cycle or so. Some can work from home in very specific situations, and if there's a long absence, we coordinate with them to make sure that they have the work that they need to do. There's also remedials that are specifically tailored for certain students who may have missed a lot of school or who need this rattrapage to help them follow along with the rest of the class. So really what we need to do is to make sure that students use these measures, and that as teachers we work with other support staff in the school to make sure that students get the best help they can get. I learned a lot about that in my PSP 305 course, Instruction aux difficultés d'apprentissage et de comportement. So we learned a lot about learning disabilities like dyslexia, and how students who have access to electronic dictionaries and such must be reminded to use them. Even in my practicum, I had some students whom I didn't even know had access to these measures until I went and saw for myself. And then I had to remind these students, hey, we're writing a text. You should use your dictionary. Oh, hey, we're writing a text next class, so do not forget your computer, because they would forget them. Even if it's not to their advantage, sometimes I guess it just slips their mind. And as teachers, we must make sure that these students use these measures, because they're made for them to perform and to learn as much as other students who do not have these learning disabilities do. Also, we have to work with the school psychologist. We have to work with the TS around the school. There's the enseignant ressources who we must coordinate with also. So these teachers will come to your classroom sometimes. Anyway, at the Triolet it was like that, and they would schedule an appointment to come during a lesson. But you have to make sure that it doesn't happen to be an exam or something. We even had a conference about that, about scheduling the right times and making sure that our lessons are planned in while thinking that, okay, there's going to be an enseignant ressource there, because some students really need that. There's also certain meetings that are scheduled. For example, my AT met with about 5 or 6 students every cycle or so, maybe every 2 cycles. She would just meet them and talk with them about their lives and how it's going at school. And these students really need that kind of support, because they need like an adult into which they can confide, because sometimes at home it's not going well, or really school becomes a safer environment for them. The second question is, in your Competency 11 update, you mention, speaking with teachers of experience in my department and during lunchtime has opened my eyes to various interventions, realities, student behaviors, and management possibilities of the school environment that I was not aware of. So the question is, Would you give some specific examples of the things you learned in these discussions and make links to theories and practices you have learned during your university courses and your practica? So yeah, of course, I learned a lot from these discussions. At first, I was, not. I was so focused on my practicum, I couldn't really um, interact much with the teachers. But after the second week or so, I started really getting into it and having deep discussions with them. Some of my favorite interventions I learned. One of them is something that my AT does when she happens to be missing a lot of students during a lesson, or one of her groups is in advance for one of the lessons compared to the others. What she does is she just speaks about life with them. She doesn't even plan anything. She just sits on the desk, writes a little bit on the board, and is like, okay, let's talk about life. Let's talk about CEGEP. It's coming up. Tell me about yourselves. Let's just get to know each other a bit more. She'll even drop the English sometimes and just speak in French with a student who needs it for this kind of discussion. And this really helps her get to know her students really well. And that comes back to my DID 413 class. It's methods in teaching ESL in different contexts, and in which we spoke at length about differentiation and how you have to get to know your students for it to work. So the more you know your students, and which you can do with this kind of intervention, the better you can tailor your lessons to their specific needs and to their specific interests. So, for example, I had a student who was interested in the military a lot, so I suggested a book in English to him, and he really liked it. I had one of my groups who had like 75% of the students in it were in a hockey team, so I could tailor some of my examples to that. And really just getting to know them better, knowing what they're going to, what kind of program they're looking forward to in CEGEP, because I was teaching Sec 4 students. So we talked at length about CEGEP when we could, and my AT had a really good idea of what made these students tick. So yeah, that was my favorite intervention. Another one was taught to me by my AT's friend, colleague. It was about escalating consequences when students do not react properly to your interventions. So, for example, if I had a student who had his or her cell phone out, and I went to confiscate it, if that student refused to give me his or her cell phone, I could escalate the consequences. Say, okay, now I was going to take it away for 1 day. I'm now taking it away for a week. And if that student still does not give you the cell phone, you can say, okay, well, you're going to the local d'encadrement on top of that. And that happened to really work. This friend of my AT, this colleague of my AT, saw me intervene with a student who had his or her cell phone out. And when he or she refused to give it to me, I did not escalate it at the time, but during a discussion in the English department, he really told me, you should be more strict. You should be stricter. You should make sure that they understand that you're not to be messed with. So really, that was one of the good interventions I was taught about. One of the realities we have also is the scandals and the colleagues who have less than appreciated attitudes. That really brought me to the PHE 400 Éthique professionnelle en enseignement course, because we talked a lot about how you need to be professional, how competency 12 is really important to follow, because otherwise you're not in an environment that's conducive to proper teaching. So really learning to be a proper human being in general, with your colleagues, with your students, with everyone. Because if there's a scandal, trust me, they talk a lot about it. One of the management possibilities I learned about also is how to speak with parents in email format. I tended to just write emails like I'm used to it, but really, my AT taught me a proper procedure to make sure that the parents receive what they need, what information they need, that it's boxed in, that there's no interpretation to have, and how to be polite and yet firm in the way that you explain how a student misbehaved, for example. So really, that was one of my these were some of the discussions I had with the other teachers that made me learn a lot. Next, the questions from Mr. Gauvin. So the first is, you clearly state in your competency 2 the importance of mastering the English language and that it is your ultimate objective. The question is, how would you describe your development of competency 2 in the light of the self-evaluation of your oral discourse from a preceding practicum, and what is still a challenge, and how will you work it out? So of course, competency 2 was one of the first competency reflections we had to make. So this happened during my first practicum back in the first semester. I learned a lot since then, and I've been immersing myself in English. All the content that I read, watch, listen to is exclusively in English nowadays. And I speak a lot in both English and French, but mostly English with my friends from the program also. So that made me develop my English tremendously in these past 4 years. I wouldn't say that I'm a perfect bilingual, but I'm at the point where it's there are still some hesitations here and there. I will mispronounce some of my words, but for the most part, it's not even comparable. Really, the development has been exceedingly positive in these past 4 years. My ANG 271 and AG 281 public speaking and second language acquisition courses have taught me a lot about how I personally can improve my use of English, especially in extemporaneous speaking, extemporaneous speech. Because that's where I will have most of my hesitations. I will have most of my I'm not sure, So really, these hesitations and my vocabulary also, I still have to work a little bit on that. So using and adapting my vocabulary to my students' levels, and making sure that the idioms and expressions that I use are used consciously, because sometimes I'll just say, keep track of something, and my students will go, oh, what is he talking about? I don't understand. Keep and track, and I have to explain that, or rule and iron fist, expressions like that. I remember using them, and I remember having to explain them to my students, because sometimes I'll just speak and it comes out naturally because I'm used to it, but my students are not. The second question is, in your text for Competency 10, you stated, a challenge I will face is becoming sufficiently organized and confident in my own tasks to bring competent opinions and suggestions to my colleagues instead of leeching off of them. The question is, could you update this statement in regards of your past practicum? So when I started the fourth practicum, I wasn't a fish in water. I was in way over my head. The first 2 weeks, I remember being in constant panic almost. I would have to, stuff my cart and go to the next classroom. I would drop things everywhere. I would forget stuff in my classroom. And generally I wasn't having a good time. To the point where I had planned to stay for an extra week just to show to my AT that I could be really, that I could follow along and show her my worth. But as time progressed, I started being able to, make it work by myself. At first, I had to always be asking for help, always asking for suggestions and solutions to my problems, and I had to learn how to deal with some of my students that I didn't really know well, because 10 days of 10 non-consecutive days wasn't enough to really get to know how some of my groups worked. But eventually, confidence came slowly but surely. I started applying what I learned in university, some of my courses, like the ones we had with Guylaine Turcot about competency 6, classroom management and evaluations, and all doing all of that by myself, but also having my AT, sometimes coming along in the classroom. At first, she was almost always there, but eventually, she'll let me be more autonomous, and that was a big mark of confidence for her. I even had enough time to start listening and giving my own opinions during interactions in the break room or the department. At some point, there was IRSS3, an organization against sexually transmitted diseases in teenagers. One of their representatives came along, and it was not planned at all. It was supposed to be for later, but she happened to not understand that it was planned for April instead of February, and she just happened to be there, and I had to I had to organize myself with that because my AT was not there that day. So I just went, okay, let's change that. The homework's going to be this instead. Okay, let's just make it as though it was planned in the agenda. I will reschedule all of my lessons, and I made it work. And my students just went, oh, okay, well, there's a surprise visitor today. So I really I made do. I was autonomous that day, really. And then I was the one who could give suggestions eventually. So, for example, with my student who really likes military, I learned about that through a text that I had made in Maurais about the best day of his life. So when his father came back from the military at some point, that was the best day of his life, and he wrote in his text that he wanted to become a soldier. And so I could share that with other teachers because that student tended to misbehave a lot. And so knowing that gave me an in with him, and I could share that with other teachers. Also, at some point, 4 teachers, including my AT and her friend, decided to prank me. So they came inside my classroom during a very important lesson, and they started messing around, and one of them was playing on his phone and made all kinds of weird noises with it. So I just I acted as though they were students, and I eventually kicked him out, and I gave him consequences, and the students found that very funny, but the teachers were very impressed because I was still able to pilot my lesson and to give all the information and to make sure that my students were following along despite having these misbehaving elements in it. So that was really a plus for me, and in further discussions, they really exclaimed that they were impressed with me, so that was really nice. I have enough time to answer one of Eric Limoges' questions. So his first question is, in your original Competency 10, you talk about trying to stay afloat and adapting as quickly as you can in your early years. Yet you also mention how teachers who have groups from the same level share their workload. The question is, could you reflect more on the impact of working with other teachers as a new teacher yourself, and how this might affect your development and workload? So I already worked with one of my colleagues during the preparation of my lessons during the practicum. We shared one of our groups together, and so the LES I created on credit cards and personal finances had to be adapted to her own schedule. She worked with PowerPoint a lot, but I was not used to that, so we had to, we really talk a lot about that and make sure that our schedules worked, that our ways of working together worked. And I gave some of the lessons first, so I could give her tips and tricks about, okay, this is going to work, this is not going to work, and she did the same with me. And sharing our planning, I used an agenda for most of the time. She used her electronic calendar, and so we had to adapt a lot, but it really worked out in the end. And really sharing ideas it was a tremendously positive experience for me. So yeah, in the future, I look forward to having similar interactions with my colleagues. In this case, it was with a fellow student teacher, but in the future, it's going to be with teachers. And that's it for me. I want to thank you. These past 4 years were so nice, so positive for me. a great deal of positive changes in my life, and really I'm looking forward to having my own classrooms and teaching to my own groups. Thank you for all that you did for us, and I wish you the best, even if in these trying times. Take care. Goodbye.